Good afternoon all. In this video, we'll talk about IBP demand planning process. Okay, before we go into the steps of demand planning process, let's understand what is demand planning. Okay, demand planning is actually forecasting the future demand or a future sales based on the past sales history. Okay, when I say past sales, it's your sales history. Okay, so now let's understand how many years or how many weeks in the future will do the demand planning, or how many weeks or how many years of sales history will consider for doing the demand planning. Okay, usually as a standard we'll do the forecasting for 18 to let's say 2 years in future, which would be actually mid to long term forecasting, right? And we'll consider the 2 to 3 years of sales history. Whenever you have a good sales history, you will have a good forecasting for the future demand. Okay, in case of short term, I mean, when I say demand planning, it would include short term planning as well as a mid to long term planning as well. So when we say short term, so you can do the forecasting for let's say 4 to 7 weeks in the future based on the past sales and the mid to long term forecasting. Okay, so that's a different concept. Let's understand the advantages of having a very good demand planning process in a organization. Okay, so first advantage is that you can reduce the inventory when you have a very good forecast accuracy. So when I say very good forecast accuracy, let's say you have 94 percentage of accuracy. It means that you have just 5 percentage difference between your sales history and a forecast, right? So you have very good forecast accuracy. So what happens? It would reduce the forecast error in the inventory optimization. So when you have a less forecast accurate, less forecast error, it would reduce the safety stock kept at a particular location, or safety stock kept at a different locations in a supply chain network. Okay, that's the main advantage of having accurate forecast. So when you have accurate forecast, it would reduce the inventory kept at a particular location, which in turn reduce the inventory holding cost, right? So everything is related to a cost. Next thing, next advantage, you can consider that you could understand the bias in your forecast. So when I say bias, bias is like having more or less forecast compared to your sales history, right? So you could understand. So whenever you have, forecast numbers, you can easily compare that with the sales history numbers in the past, right? So you could understand easily the bias one. And next one, as I said, so when I say demand planning, so in IBP you have two demand planning processes actually. So first thing is that you are classical demand planning. When I say classical demand planning, it's your mid to long term thing. Okay, and you also have a short term demand signals or short term demand planning. We call that as demand sensing in the IBP demand. Okay, so you can combine these two signals and give it to the supply planning. So when I say combine these two, let's say first let's 5 to 7 weeks, you give a demand sensing input, and after a seventh week, you give mid to long term demand planning outputs. Okay, and combination of these two, you give it as input for supply planning process. Okay, and the last advantage, of course you may have many advantages. I've just noted down four advantages here. Okay, and the last advantage that I mentioned here is that you could deploy the quantities more accurately. So when I say deploy quantities more accurately, let's say you have very good forecast, it means that you know what is the quantity or what is the demand which is available at a particular location, right? So when you are distributing a demand from, or when you are distributing a supply from let's say manufacturing plant to distribution center, you have to understand what is the demand coming actually from a particular distribution center, so that you could deploy the quantities there. Okay, so that what happens, so let's say you got a demand of 100, and you could actually deploy total 100 quantity, or you could satisfy full demand. Then it means that you have 100% service level, right? Sometimes you have less supply and more demand, or less demand more supply. So these are all warning signals, right? So that's why, so it's always good to have accurate forecast and a better demand planning process. Okay, now let's see the demand planning process steps. Okay, you see here the diagram shows, right? You have a segmentation, time series analysis, and then you have a statistical forecasting. So these are all the functionalities available in demand planning process. So before you do the forecasting, you understand the data or the information available in your combinations, and you also understand the sales history pattern. So when I say pattern, so you have to understand whether a particular combination is having seasonal sales or trend sales or constant sales. So that you need to understand before you do the forecasting, right? And again, when I say segmentation, you have to segment your combination in a way that you have to put particular combinations in high profile products or high importance, right? And you could also segment your combinations based on their demand volatility, importance, those things. Okay, let's see those steps later. Okay, for now this is just an overview of all the steps that you have here. Okay, let's go to the steps. First thing, as you see, this is a full demand planning process steps, right? You see, so we'll start with the data preparation. So when we say data preparation, first thing is that you have to understand what is the sales history that you are using for demand planning process, or what is the product portfolio that you are using for demand planning process. Let's say you are doing a demand planning process only for your finished goods or only for a few combinations, so that you ought to understand and then bring the sales history. So when I say data preparation, you have to understand the sales history that you are extracting from source systems. Okay, you have to bring the sales history in the data preparation step. And once you get the sales history, right, next thing is that, of course, you may not use these steps which I mentioned here. After data preparation, you have a ABC XYZ and time series analysis. It's not mandatory that you have to use these two. Okay, without these two also you could go to the forecasting. But if you want to understand, or if you want to do more accurate forecasting, then it's better to have the segmentation and time series analysis. Okay, and in the next videos, I'll give some insights on ABC XYZ, time series analysis, and remaining steps in the demand planning process. But in this video, I'll just give you a brief overview of all these steps. Okay. So after data preparation, you can use ABC XYZ, which is for segmenting your combinations based on the importance. So when we say importance, what is important for us in real time? What is important for us? It's a revenue, right? The profits. So based on the revenue, we can do the segmentation, and based on the demand volatility. Okay, importance and the demand volatility. So sometimes you cannot easily do the forecasting for some combinations because they exhibit lot of demand volatilities, right? So you have to segment the combinations based on their importance and demand volatility. So, okay, so ABC is for actually segmenting based on their importance, and XYZ is based on their demand volatilities. So when we say importance or demand volatilities, usually use a revenue, and for demand volatility you use a sales history. Okay, so you do the segmentation based on these two factors and put the information in respective attributes. Okay, you can do the segmentation at a product level, or you can also do it at location product level, whatever the level that you want to do. Okay, that's the segmentation. So once you do the segmentation, you'll get a fair idea on how to do the forecasting as well. Why? Because let's say you have very high important combinations and less volatile combinations, so it's easy to forecast. And when you have very high volatile combinations, then you have to use some intermittent models or some other models to do the forecasting accurately, right? That's the segmentation. Now coming to the time series analysis. When you say time series analysis, the name itself says that analyzing your time series. So time series means your sales history. So whenever you say time series, it's like your data on weekly buckets or monthly buckets, right? So time, based on a time, your quantity would increase or decrease, whatever, right? So it's like quantities depends on the time, right? So usually the time series analysis is for analyzing the patterns in your sales history. So when I say analyzing the pattern, pattern as in, let's say you take any product, right? You take umbrellas. This is just an example, okay? You take an umbrella which would have high sales in rainy season, right? And in other seasons, you may not have, that much sales because it's a seasonal product. So you could easily understand a single product, right? You could understand what kind of time series property it has, right? But in case if you have thousands of products, right, how do you understand it, their patterns? You cannot, right? Thousands of products, you cannot predict, or you cannot even analyze the data because it takes a lot of time and it may go wrong because we are doing it manually, right? So in case if we could do the analysis of all the thousand combinations based on their sales history, it would be very helpful to you to do the forecasting, isn't it? Let's say you do the analysis and you could segregate the combinations based on their property. Let's say some products or some combinations have, let's say, seasonal patterns with downward or upward seasonality, oh sorry, downward or upward trend, right? And some combinations are having, let's say, seasonality with additive seasonality or multiplicative seasonality, or some are having continuous sales, some are having constant sales. So this time series analysis, or we call it as a forecast automation. So this step would actually give you a lot of information on how to do the forecasting, or which forecasting algorithms you need to select to get the best or a better accuracy. Okay, after you know the ABC XYZ and time series properties, you could easily select suitable forecasting models, right? So you could select a multiple models which would actually give a better forecast for each and every property of a combination, right? That's the next step. So once you get ABC XYZ, you have to choose a better forecasting algorithms, or I mean, when I say forecasting model, within which you will have all the algorithms, okay? So that you need to choose. That's the next step. You have to select the forecasting model. And then in case, let's say your sales history has some abnormalities, or we call them as outliers sometimes, okay? You may have, let's say, null values or intermittent values, right? And you may have some, abnormal values which would actually impact your future forecasting, which would actually give wrong signals to your forecasting algorithm, right? So to remove or to avoid the effect of these outliers or abnormal values, we have to cleanse them, we have to clean them, and then use the forecasting. So after selecting a good forecasting model, you have to cleanse your sales history. That's your pre-processing step, right? Before we do the forecasting, we have to cleanse your sales history. Again, the data cleansing has multiple algorithms like outlier detection and outlier correction methods. That also I'll talk in the next videos. Okay. Once you do the outlier correction or data cleansing, you have to go with a statistical forecasting. You have to run the statistical forecasting. What it does, the statistical forecasting would actually generate the future forecast. It will generate the future demand. So forecasting would generate a future demand or future sales based on the past information. Okay. And then, as you know, you will have a post processing step. So whenever we say post processing step, this is actually part of your statistical model only. So post processing is like, based on some forecast errors, like, so you have a mean absolute percentage error or mean absolute deviation. So you'll have some forecast error measures, we would say. Okay, so that would generate some forecast error. So whenever we run a statistical forecasting models, right? So what it does, it will actually generate a forecast or generate the future demand based on a less error. Okay, so that we can see. Okay, I'll talk about that in the future videos. And then once you generate the forecast, what you do, what is the next? So that's just a statistical forecast. So when we say statistical forecast, it is the forecast that was generated by statistical algorithms. Okay, and then what happens based on some insights of a market or a sales, the market and sales people would do some kind of inputs. So, okay, you see your promotional planning. So you could also have some promotional planning. So when we say promotional planning, let's say you have some advertisements, like you do some advertisements to increase the sales, right? And you also give some discount, like 1+1 discount, 20%, 30% discount. So these are all comes under of promotional planning, right? So with this you could increase your sales. So that input would also be added to the statistical algorithm. So the statistical algorithms would generate a forecast. On top of that, the market and sales people would add some inputs, and again the promotional planning would also add some kind of sales to it, right? I mean, when I say sales, it's a future sales. So all together we get some total forecast, and that would be treated as a local demand plan as well as your global demand plan. So at a local demand plan level, the inputs can be added, or whatever the forecast that was generated by promotional planning and statistical planning, right, that would be just given as a local demand plan and a global demand plan. So, and as in the demand review, or uh, step of SNOP planning, I mean sales and operations planning, you'll have a consensus meeting where we or the planners would come to a consensus, and then they'll finalize or uh, publish your forecast, I would say. Okay, so that's your final forecast or the output of your demand planning process, and that output would be given to a supply planning, as well as can be used as an input for inventory optimization, and can also be given to the deployment planning as well.